Let's dig into Alkermes first. So for our listeners, on November the 1st, Alkermes, and that's ticker symbol ALKS, for our listeners, had the opportunity to make its case for its depression drug, ALKS 5461, we'll just call it 5461, in front of an FDA advisory panel of experts. And 5461 has been studied, is still being studied in treatment-resistant major depressive disorder. But this drug in and of itself has had quite the roller coaster history. I mean, even looking at earlier this year, Todd, in April, at one point you had the FDA issuing a refuse to file letter, which is, it's in the grand scheme of things, a complete response letter is terrible. But when the FDA refuses to even look at your drug because they say it's not complete enough, that is like red flag of red flags. But 2 weeks later, all of a sudden, the FDA did an about face. Alkermes came out and said that they were able to, quote, clarify some things with the FDA. But Todd, what is all the fuss with this drug, 5461?
Yeah, it makes you wonder whether or not they really clarified things or if they basically just strong-armed and said, we're filing it anyways.
Exactly.
And the FDA said, hey, do it at your own risk. Do it at your own risk. Because overwhelmingly, and I urge everybody just to go out and check out the notes or the backgrounder that was put together by the FDA for the members of the advisory committee. Just as a refresher, what ends up happening with many of these drugs that go through the FDA process of approval is that the company will make a presentation in front of a panel of experts in that field and try to convince that panel of experts that their drug is both efficacious, so it works, and that it's safe, so it doesn't harm anybody. Relative to the efficacy that it delivers. And that's what we're talking about. The FDA advisory committee panel meeting met to weigh in on 5461, and they voted overwhelmingly against its approval. I think the vote for against approval was 21 to 2. Yeah, 21 to 2 overall against approving it. 20 to 3 said that the Alkermes did not provide substantial evidence of the drug's effectiveness, which is crazy. Only convinced 3 people that this FDA that this drug was approvable for efficacy. And then on safety, it squeaked by with safety barely. 13 votes in favor on safety versus 10. And I think that if you read the backgrounder that was put together by the FDA for these committee members, you'd certainly feel a slant against this drug by the FDA. And it'd be interesting to, I guess you just would assume that probably factored into the committee members' decision.
And there were so many interesting things, and I would encourage any healthcare investor, if you are investing in the biotech space, I would say this is just as important as reviewing SEC filings, but reviewing the advisory committee briefing documents, to your point, Todd, is crucial because oftentimes a company may issue a press release or they'll say, we had very successful talks with the FDA and we're both on the same page. And really, I think what this panel demonstrated and highlighted is that that's not always the case. And so in looking at this drug, it was novel, not just the drug itself, but even too from like a study design perspective as well. Todd, what can you tell us just about the drug itself? Because this is not your typical antidepressant.
Alkermes, I think, was thinking that because there's such a big need for new therapies that can address depression, I think they were thinking that they could push this over the finish line. There's about 15 million people, Shannon, in America who suffer from major depression. About 3 million new cases of major depression are diagnosed per year. And, sadly, or, unfortunately, 60 to 70% of people with depression fail to respond to the existing antidepressant therapies that are on the market. And less than 30% achieve remission in depression on the first line of therapy that they try. So what ends up happening is that, they go through this multiple lines of trying and failing on different antidepressants, hoping to find the right one that'll work for them. And part of that is because we don't fully understand the cause of depression. We can make some assumptions about biology, and we can make some assumptions. We know that the environment can factor into the causing it as well. Most of the antidepressants, what they try to do, Shannon, is they try to manipulate the amount of chemicals that are in your brain. So things like serotonin. to try and improve mood. This was going to be an entirely novel approach, an entirely new approach. What they were doing at Alkermes was combining together an opioid and a second compound that was designed to prevent the opioid, from you becoming addicted to the opioid. So you had buprenorphine, which is the opioid part of 5461, and samidorphan, which was the new entity that was trying to counteract the negative or the risks associated with taking buprenorphine. So the idea here was, okay, we know that opiates have, can improve mood. Is there a way that we can make them less addictive? And, we look at the trial design, the way that Alkermes set up the trials to try and win approval. And then, again, reading this backgrounder, wow. And they actually said in the backgrounder at one point, the FDA wrote that there was, quote, a lack of alignment between the applicant and the FDA on this new drug application. A lack of alignment. I mean, it's really weird when you're being told by the FDA, hey, these are the things that you should probably do if you want to come in front of us and win approval. And you're just basically ignoring them and saying, no, we're going to do these things and we're just going to hope that you give us approval.
Yeah. And so, and that I think is what has been the big head scratcher here, because you sometimes expect to see this with really small, very early stage biotechs. You don't expect to see it with a company like Alkermes. I believe they're about $6 billion market cap company with approved products already on the market. So that was a bit of a head scratcher. And going back to that trial design, it's something called sequential parallel comparison design, or SPCD. And the reason that Alkermes was attempting to use this novel study design that the FDA didn't think had much merit was really trying to get after one of the major problems that they see with depression trials, and that's the placebo effect. And you see this consistently with drug companies that attempt to go after this depression indication, is that oftentimes when a patient is exposed to placebo, they have improvements, and it makes it much harder to see the actual effect of the drug in the trials. So Alkermes was attempting to mitigate this with this study design. Basically, they failed. I'm trying to think of a nice way to say it. They failed.
Downright failed. But, I mean, because you think about the people who will enroll in a trial, Shannon, it's going to be the ones who are most motivated to want to see an improvement. And I think that that's probably why you see the placebo effect typically being high in these trials. And historically, that's been a big problem for drug developers because, one of the failure rates in depression and related disorders are much higher than they are in, say, other disorders where maybe you can connect the dots a little bit more easily to treatment versus outcome. And this two-stage trial design approach, basically what they did is they randomized for the drug and for placebo, and then they took the non-responders, and that's from that stage one that were in the placebo group, and then randomized again into either placebo or the drug. And, the FDA basically said, geez, we've never really considered this for any trial. We would need to see a lot more evidence to be convinced that this is a good way to design it. And I guess, apparently, obviously, Alkermes did not deliver that. It wasn't the only problem, though. They also designed the trial to take an average of outcomes over multiple weeks. And historically, when trials are designed for this indication, they use a fixed endpoint. So, the improvement at the 6-week mark or the 4-week mark or the 5-week mark, whatever. And in this case, Alkermes was trying to convince them, no, use an average. And the division, they actually wrote in this backgrounder, the division did not prospectively agree on this approach. So they already had told Alkermes, listen, we're not really comfortable with this. And then the third problem that Alkermes had, or the third decision that they made that went against, I guess, what the FDA was hoping that they would do, is they used an entirely new rating scale that they crafted. The Montgomery-Åsberg Depression Scale rating is commonly used, but it's a 10-item questionnaire. And they cherry picked, all right? They created their own 6-item version of it that excluded some pretty important stuff like, suicidal thoughts.
The actual important things, and particularly more so the things that really have not just a long-term impact, but to your point, like suicide, concentration difficulties, reduced appetite, reduced sleep. These are all things that are important for someone who suffers from depression. Of course, in terms of what's next for the company, you've got, of course, just to back up a little bit for our listeners. So the FDA Advisory Committee, they make a recommendation to the FDA whether or not to approve a drug. The FDA doesn't have to follow those recommendations. And sometimes you've even seen the FDA be a little more lenient when it comes to psychotic therapies. But right now, Alkermes, they're still running, I believe, Todd, a phase 3B study. Not a lot of hope, especially given the trial results that we've already seen. But they do have a approval date of January the 31st, so we could find out before then whether or not the FDA gives the green light. But thankfully, it sounds like this isn't the only thing that Alkermes has in the pipeline. Right, Todd?
Yeah, it's not a one-trick pony. It already generates about $250 million in sales per quarter. If you look at last quarter, sales were up about 14%. It markets a drug, Vivitrol, that's used to help prevent relapses for people who are addicted to alcohol or that use drugs. Sales of that drug were $80 million last quarter, up 15% year over year. It also has an atypical antipsychotic drug, Aristada, that's approved and generating revenue growth for the company. And then it also collects royalties on a bunch of different antipsychotic drugs that are on the market already and marketed by some of the largest companies in the world. So, I mean, this is definitely a company that it generates revenue on an adjusted basis. It turns a profit, but this is obviously a disappointing failure because it's a multi-billion-dollar marketplace, and that could have turned this 5461 into a billion-dollar blockbuster for them. They do have their next thing that investors are going to want to keep an eye out for is results from a drug called, I think it's 3831. That's being evaluated in schizophrenia, and basically it is a version of Zyprexa, which is commonly used, but patents expired on it, so they can manipulate it if they want, and they are. They're manipulating it so that it doesn't result in weight gain, which has been a big drawback of Zyprexa. And phase 3 results are expected before the end of this year. If they're positive, they could file for FDA approval next year. And Zyprexa's peak sales were above $2 billion, so theoretically, this could add nicely to its sales in the future.
Absolutely. And also, too, what's really interesting is Alkermes also has an early immuno-oncology asset in their pipeline now. It'll be interesting to see this traditionally CNS-focused company pivot into immuno-oncology, but certainly something to keep an eye on.